They came without warning, crossing the open plains before dawn, the sound of hooves carried by wind that reached villages too late to matter. By the time doors opened, fire had already claimed the first thatched roofs. Men ran with axes. Women hid their children beneath floorboards, and by nightfall, silence covered what had been a living community. For centuries, this was how life began and ended along the borderlands of Eastern Europe. Not by famine nor by plague, but by the trade in human beings. Between 1441 and 1774, an empire built on speed and terror flourished in the shadow of the Black Sea. The Crimean Khanate and the Nogai horde rode out again and again, taking people from the fields of Russia and the towns of Polish-Lithuania, selling them southward into markets that stretched from Kaffa to Constantinople. In their world, the value of a life could be measured in coins, and every journey toward home risked ending in chains. Historians would later call these the slave raids of steppe. But for those who lived through them, there was no name that could contain what they saw. Entire regions were emptied. Villages that once echoed with songs became ash and grass. Children were carried away so young that they would never again hear their own language. A generation born into fear learned to listen to the ground before they slept. Yet even in that darkness, a question began to rise. How long can people live under threat before they become their own defense? From the ashes of those taken came the shape of resistance. Rough men and women who refused to disappear, who learned to fight on the same ground where they had once fallen. They called themselves Cossacks, and the world would remember them not for surrender, but for how fiercely they answered back. This is their story, a story of capture and rebellion, of human trade and human defiance, of how ordinary people, cornered by fear, built the courage to push back against centuries of enslavement. The steppe was not empty ground. It was an economy. Long before the thunder of hooves reached the village, networks of merchants, port agents, and political patrons were already waiting to turn bodies into currency. Coastal towns like Kaffa were hubs in a trade that stretched from the northern borderlands to the markets of the Ottoman world. Captives taken on planes moved fast, marched to temporary holding pens, ferried to Black Sea ports, and loaded on ships bound for cities where demand for labor and domestic servants was steady and profitable. What looked like sudden violence on the ground was, in truth, the sharp end of a long supply chain. Raiding followed a rhythm. Seasonal weather, harvest cycles, and military opportunities shaped when parties rode out. Often the largest campaigns coincided with broader wars or diplomatic openings, when central authorities were distracted and frontier law was weakest. The raiders themselves were skilled horsemen, expert at living off the plain and using speed as their greatest weapon. A mounted strike could reach a settlement, snatch people, and dissolve into the distance before heavier forces could respond. Over 3 centuries, these raids were repeated with frequency that blurred the line between war and routine terror. Numbers in these archives resist neat summary, but the scale is undeniable. Contemporary records and later estimates suggest hundreds of thousands, and according to some historians, possibly millions, were taken over the centuries. Local scholars and foreign chroniclers recorded whole districts emptied, and historians estimate that in certain periods the flows of captives were enormous, with single campaigns taking thousands at a time. A nearly final large-scale sweep came in 1769 during the Russo-Turkish conflict, when one campaign reportedly took some 20,000 people, an event that signaled both the endurance and the eventual limits of the practice. These figures are raw and contested, but they make clear that this was not occasional pillage. It was an economic engine. The markets themselves were organized. Captives were sorted, appraised for age, health, and skills, and then sold to a wide range of buyers, households, plantation owners, officials, and military households across the Ottoman lands. Crimean elites, local intermediaries, and foreign merchants all profited. The Khan received a formal share of the proceeds as tribute in some years. That economic integration explains why raids could persist even when rulers publicly disavowed them. The incentives were woven into politics, patronage, and regional commerce. When supply and demand meet across borders, stopping the trade requires breaking a complex set of relationships, not only winning a single battle. For frontier communities, the daily calculus changed. Survival meant watching field with weapons, building simple defenses, and learning to move quickly. Local leaders organized militias, and free people who had once been farmers or traders took up arms as a matter of course. These ragged formations practiced river strikes, ambushes, and fortification of vulnerable hamlets. Over time, some of these irregular defenders coalesced into more durable military communities along rivers like the Dnieper and the Don. The name that emerges in the record, Cossacks, covers many groups and many motivations, but one constant is clear. Their rise is inseparable from the need to repel the raids and to recover captives when possible. Religion, ransom practices, and civic networks also mattered. Churches and synagogues, noble households, and local officials pooled funds to redeem captives. Letters and petitions asked rulers for protection or reprisal. That rescue economy, small-scale, tireless, and often improvised, saved thousands of lives across generations. Equally, the social fabric reshaped itself. Villages learned to live with alarm systems, songs that warn of riders on the horizon, and legal customs that prioritized ransom and mutual aid. Those adaptations would later be remembered in folklore and legal codes, and they left a mark on how borderland societies understood security and solidarity. The result was a frontier world where violence and trade fed one another. The raiders' success depended on buyers. The buyers depended on steady supply. The suppliers depended on the ability to cross contested lands. Breaking that chain required not just military victory, but institutional change, the strengthening of state presence, and shifts in international politics. In the end, the decline of large-scale expeditions was as much about geopolitics, the rise of Russian power, and the changing priorities of the Ottoman realm, as it was about the grit of those who refused to remain captives. When raids arrived, they met more than smoke and shattered roofs. They met men and women who had learned to move as quickly as the threat they faced. From a panic and the rubble came organized resistance, raw and resourceful, born on the same plains that had once made the raiders unstoppable. These defenders were rarely the polished soldiers of a distant capital. They were neighbors, fathers, blacksmiths, boatmen, and young people who had no choice but to transform themselves into fighters. The name most remembered from those borderlands, Cossacks, does not point to a single tribe or creed. It describes a loose constellation of riverborne communities, partly freebooters, partly farmers, partly frontier soldiers, who mixed daily labor with readiness for sudden violence. Their craft was shaped by the ground itself. Light, fast horses, shallow draft boats of the Dnieper's currents, weapons that could be carried by a single rider, and a knowledge of marshes and ravines that made pursuit costly. Cossack bands would slip away into reeds as quickly as they had appeared, and they learned to strike where the raiders felt safest. Supply lines, holding pens, and coastal paths to the ports. Tactics mattered. The raiders excelled at speed and surprise. The defenders learned to turn the same elements against them. Rivers became front lines. Boats carried raiding parties across unexpected channels, and also carried rescue missions back toward home. Night watches and signal fires gave small hamlets time to hide children and move cattle. Ambushes, often staged from hedgerows and riverbanks, punished raiders who lingered. Where state authorities were weak, local commanders organized quick reaction groups that could intercept mounted columns on open ground or harass them as they tried to cross bogs. Over time, these improvised responses hardened into the reputation of a people who could not be taken at will. The psychology of defense mattered as much as the technology. When entire communities pooled money for ransom, they were not only buying back a life, they were making a statement that a person taken would not be lost to the world. Letters pleading for help, lists of names kept in churches, and records of exactions by local lords all show a public life devoted to rescue and reprisal. Some captives were recovered in daring raids, others bought by relatives and neighbors, and some managed to escape. Each recovered life became a lesson in mutual obligation and a reason to sharpen local forces further. Yet the line between defense and offense blurred easily. The same boat that carried a freed family upriver could transport a revenge party into Crimean lands. Some retaliatory raids targeted slave pens, some looked for ransom, and some were acts of vengeance that perpetuated cycles of violence. The Cossacks' image shifted depending on the teller. They were heroes to those who saw them free captives, and threats to those whose wealth or political order they disrupted. That ambiguity is part of their historical power. There were moments when local ingenuity changed broader strategy. Small flotillas of light craft, commanded by men who knew every sandbar, could strike at the mouth of a river where captives were gathered before shipment. Night raids on holding pens sometimes liberated dozens, sometimes provoked larger conflicts that drew in state armies. As the defenders hardened, raiders adapted too, changing routes and relying more on larger campaigns when opportunities arose. This back and forth made the frontier a laboratory of irregular warfare, where tactics flowed from necessity and geography. Not every rescue ended in success, and not every raid met a swift answer. Many tragedies could not be reversed, and entire families never returned. Still, the emergence of organized defense shifted the calculus of power. What had once been a seemingly effortless transfer of people into markets became riskier and costlier. Over generations, that friction added up. Supply lines frayed, the political appetite for unchecked raids diminished, and the practical cost of slave-taking rose. This section of history is not merely a record of battles and numbers. It is a story of communities that refused to be erased and of a kind of citizen soldiery that emerged where no state had fully solved the frontier problem. Their methods were imperfect, their motives mixed, but their impact was clear. The human trade that had once flowed with terrifying ease was now contested on every crossing, every river, and every road. Paper and memory became weapons in their own way. When steel and speed failed to stop a raid, people turned to ink and petition, to lists and prayers, and in those margins we find the faces that official history sometimes overlook. Parish registers, ransom receipts, and plaintiff petitions to princes survive in fragments across archives. Taken together, they form a chorus of names: mothers and sons, bakers and millers, toddlers and elders, each line of proof that a life once belonged to a community that would not let it be erased without a struggle. Look at the parish registers, and you see gaps where births and marriages should be, sudden silences that match the seasons of raiding. In town ledgers and port manifests, you find entries for human merchandise, noted with the same dry efficiency as grain or timber. In private letters, grief is raw and immediate. Pleas for help, account of the night the riders came, list of what was lost and what could be offered for ransom. Those letters were sometimes read aloud in marketplaces and churches, and they set whole neighborhoods to work collecting coins, sewing shawls, and negotiating terms with traders and officials who could reach the ports. Ransom receipts are among the most intimate records. They record the exchange of money for a life returned. Many are small notes of barter and prayer, a few coins handed over for a child's liberty. Others are long negotiations led by families who mortgaged land, sold livestock, or begged patrons for sums large enough to change a household's future. Each successful ransom was a small, fierce victory, and each failure left a hole in the communal memory that generations would feel. These documents make clear that landholders, church networks, and merchants all played informal roles in a rescue economy that ran parallel to the formal diplomacy between states. Petitions of princes and envoys show another side of survival, the attempt to bring state power into the rescue. Clerics and civic leaders begged for garrisons, for punitive expeditions, or for negotiated limits on raiding seasons. Sometimes the responses were quick. Sometimes they were promises that arrived too late. Those letters reveal not only the desperation of ordinary people, but also the constraints of rulers who had to balance war, diplomacy, and finance. Reading these appeals is to hear both hope and the weary calculus of those who work to protect their own while understanding the limits of authority. The archives also reveal broader markets and networks. Port lists, customs books, and merchant correspondence trace the routes captives took from holding pens to ships and onward to cities where they were absorbed into households or labor systems. These commercial documents show that the human trade relied on predictable logistics and on people who treated supply as business. The more we study those records, the more we see that stopping the raids required not only local courage, but also disruption of the trade routes and the people who profited from them. Oral history survives, too, passed in songs and laments, in folk rhymes that encode warnings, and in proverbs that remember raids as part of life's hazards. These memories, recorded later by traveling scribes or by local chroniclers, often preserve details that official registers miss. The name of a river crossing, the cry of a child taken at a doorway, the custom that saved a family by hiding them in a hayloft. Folklore may alter facts, but it keeps the emotional truth that these events marked ordinary lives deeply and left an imprint on community identity. For the modern reader, These documents force a reckoning. They are not merely academic curiosities. They are evidence of economies and policies that treated people as objects and of communal responses that insisted on human dignity. They complicate narratives that would reduce the story to a clash of empires by returning us to the scale of daily life, to who was taken, who paid, who hid, and who dragged a rescued brother into the light. As we close these pages and stand in the archive's dim rooms, the names and sums and pleas form a quieter, more persistent testimony than any victory banner. They show that rescue, ransom, and remembrance were central to survival, and that communities, not only kings, kept a record of what had been lost. For centuries, the raiding economy survived because it fit into larger balances of power. Crimean Khans could ride with apparent impunity when their patrons in Istanbul needed allies, and when the great continental powers found it useful to tolerate a semi-autonomous steppe that channeled wealth and pressure southward. But empires change, and by the 18th century the balance began to move against the old order. What followed was not a single decisive battle, but a long political unraveling in which war, diplomacy, and imperial ambition combined to cut the raiders' lifelines. The Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774 was a turning point. Russian armies pushed deeply into Ottoman territory, and the conflict stretched the resources of both empires, while exposing the vulnerability of a Crimean Khanate that had long operated as a semi-independent actor. The peace that ended the fighting, the Treaty of Cuca-Camarca in 1774, nominally granted Crimea independence from Ottoman suzerainty, but in practice it handed Russia a level of influence that the Khanate could not withstand. Ports and trade routes once available to Crimean elites now fell within a sphere where Russian naval and diplomatic weight could be brought to bear. That diplomatic squeeze mattered for two reasons. First, markets depend on predictable access and protection. As Russia secured greater control over the Black Sea littoral, the logistics that once fed the human traffic into Ottoman markets were disrupted. Second, independence in name alone left the Khans exposed to new pressure from a state with expanding administrative reach. Russian influence meant that raids became riskier for the patrons and intermediaries who had previously treated captive flows as routine commerce. The last decades of organized large-scale expeditionary raiding show a steep political cost that buyers and brokers found harder to ignore. The late 18th century also produced dramatic military and administrative changes on the Russian side. Fortification lines were extended, and frontier governance moved from ad hoc local defense toward organized military colonization. The Belgrade defensive system and later lines aimed to deny raiders easy access to rich agricultural lands, and state support for Cossack hosts intensified. Cossacks themselves were increasingly drawn into formal arrangements with Moscow and Warsaw at different times, converting irregular frontier resistance into instruments of state policy as well as local defense. That process both professionalized some of the defenders and folded their energy into imperial aims that would remake the map of the region. The raids did not end overnight. In 1769, during the turmoil of the Russo-Turkish Wars, one of the last great Tatar expeditions reportedly seized some 20,000 people, an event that underscored both the persistence of the practice and the scale of human cost even as political winds were shifting. But those very wars, the treaties that followed, and the strategic reach of Russian power combined over a few decades to make large-scale slave-taking increasingly costly and politically untenable. By the 1780s, the path of decline was clear. Diplomatic settlements, Russian naval access to the Black Sea, and eventual formal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 1783 removed the political and logistical conditions that had sustained the trade. Annexation carried its own consequences. For many Crimean Tatars, the loss of autonomy meant dispossession and exile. For the region's markets, it meant a forced reconfiguration of labor and commercial networks. The end of systematic raids did not erase the damage or the moral responsibility of those who profited for generations. Instead, it closed one chapter in a longer story of violent economies, imperial expansion, and the painful remaking of borderland societies. Scholars point out that breaking a trade in human beings requires both military pressure and institutional shifts, the strengthening of policing, changes in diplomatic incentives, and the economic rerouting that makes trafficking unprofitable. That is what the late 18th century produced in the Black Sea world. Still, endings are partial. Small raiding parties continued. Some captives remained unredeemed for years, and communities carried deep scars. The formal decline of the trade did not instantly translate into social healing. Depopulated districts, altered settlement patterns, and the memory of lost-shaped demographics and local law for generations. At the same time, the absorption of Cossack forces into imperial structures helped turn the very fighters who once protected villages into instruments of state expansion, complicating any simple moral ledger of heroism and violence. When the dust settled, the map of power around the Black Sea looked different. Where mobile raids had once been a structural feature of frontier life, now stood fortified towns, imperial administrations, and naval squadrons asserting control. The long, grim commerce in human lives had been cut by force and politics, but its traces remained in family records, in place names, and in a culture that had learned to watch the horizon. When the raids slowed and the sound of distant hooves faded, the work of living began again, but it was a different kind of labor. Rebuilding meant more than fixing roofs. It meant remapping a life that had been rent in pieces. Some villages never rose from their ashes. Their fields left to brush and scrub. Others tightened into denser settlements. Families clustering together in ways that made every barn and doorway a shared responsibility. These changes in settlement patterns were practical answers to a simple truth. The open plain had been revealed as a danger, and people adjusted their lives to reduce exposure. Scholars note that over centuries, frontier populations shifted away from scattered homesteads toward more concentrated villages and fortified lines as a direct response to chronic raiding. Economies shifted too. Where labor had once been plentiful, depopulation created gaps that altered agriculture and local trade. Families that had ransomed loved ones often paid a price. Land sold, debts taken on, future productivity diminished. In some cases, entire regions saw a long-term demographic drag, as births fell and migration patterns changed. Recent research highlights how such persistent predation left measurable developmental scars across parts of Eastern Europe, effects that could be seen in population maps and even in later economic indicators. The human cost therefore became an economic legacy, woven into the slow arithmetic of who stayed, who left, and who could not be bought back. Memory became a public project. Churches and communal registers preserved lists of names, and laments became a form of living history passed down in song and proverb. Oral traditions carried precise, local knowledge, which foe to avoid, which neighbor to trust, which family had once paid an impossible ransom. Those stories shaped identity, informing law and custom. In some places, legal codes adapted to prioritize collective defense and ransom rights, while in others, rituals of memorial and yearly remembrances kept the stolen alive in communal imagination. Through these cultural forms, the trauma of capture entered into the moral grammar of borderland life, setting rules about mutual aid, vigilance, and honor that outlasted the raids themselves. The archives kept their testimony as well. Petition books and ransom receipts continued to be read for generations, reminders that state power had often been too slow or too distant. Families who had bargained with merchants and magistrates left behind records that scholars now use to measure both loss and resilience. Those documents also reveal how difficult it was to translate private rescue into public policy. Many appeals for protection met the limits of finance and diplomacy. Still, the persistence of these records helped build a historical conscience, an evidence-based witness that later generations could not easily ignore. Politically, the long-term consequences were paradoxical. The rise of stronger imperial states eventually closed some of the routes that had fed the trade in human beings. But the absorption of frontier fighters into state structures changed the nature of power on the ground. Cossack hosts that had once been local defenders were increasingly enrolled by Moscow and Warsaw, professionalized in ways that secured borders but also bound those fighters to imperial aims. The annexation of Crimea and the consolidation of Russian naval and administrative control over the Black Sea literally cut off major logistics for slave shipments and reshaped regional politics. Yet those same changes also produced dispossession and demographic engineering in Crimea itself, as new settlement policies and colonization remade the peninsula. The moral ledger of these shifts is complicated. Decline in one form of violence coincided with new forms of state-driven displacement and control. Finally, there is a legal and ethical afterlife. Breaking an entrenched trade required institutional shifts, stronger policing, different diplomatic incentives, and economic rerouting. That took generations to achieve. Even after formal control reduced the scale of the raids, the social practices born of fear remained. Legal norms around ransom, mutual aid, and local defense continued to influence how communities governed themselves. The memory of those centuries would also shape later debates about borders, minority rights, and the responsibilities of states to protect vulnerable populations. In the quiet spaces of local archives and the melodies of old lamentations, the story of those who were taken continued to speak, reminding new generations that the price of survival is often counted long after the last fires are put out. History resists tidy labels. On the borderlands, the lines between captor and captive, rescuer and robber, settled and stranger often blurred into a single messy human reality. Some people taken from their homes over the Black Sea were absorbed into new lives in distant towns. Some learned new trades, married, and rose in status. Others never forgot, and their return could bring joy and renewed pain in equal measure. At the same time, some raiders who rode with horses and lances would settle, marry locally, and become part of the very communities they once hunted. These shifts force us to confront a harsh truth. People adapt to survive, and survival reshapes identity. Consider the captive who grows into adulthood in a foreign household, learns a new tongue, and finds a place inside an urban economy. To call that person merely a victim erases a life they later built, and to celebrate their assimilation without noting the loss it required is to simplify suffering into triumph. Some captives maintained memory by secret songs and private prayers. Others adopted new customs and in time defended the household that once held them. That duality appears again and again in records and in letters, and it complicates the moral map of the era. On the raiders' side, motivations were not uniform. For some it was profit pure and simple, a livelihood taken from the steppes of commerce and patronage. For others it was a generational practice, tied to clan obligation and survival in a harsh landscape. A young rider might join a raid because it was the surest path to bride wealth, or because a chief demanded service, or because local order offered few other options. When those riders later settled, their children often inherited the status of farmer or trader, and communities that had once been targets could find new members who bore the memory of both roles. Those who freed captives were also complicated. A raid that recovered dozens might be praised in song, yet the same raid could slip into pillage or revenge, and those rescued might be exchanged for hostages or given as leverage in negotiations. The practice of ransom saved lives, but also placed a price on them, and the calculus of who could be saved often depended on wealth, status, and access to patrons. A wealthy family might buy back a child. A poor family might bury their loss in silence. That inequity shaped community memory and created moral tensions that lasted generations. Religious and cultural exchange added another layer. Captives taken southward encountered different faiths and customs, and some converted, whether by force, by convenience, or by conviction. In port cities and households, Jews, Christians, and Muslims all played roles in the commerce and ransom networks that created instances of rescue across confessional lines, and also produced stories of conversion and reconciliation that historians must handle with care. To reduce those stories to simple triumph or betrayal is to miss how individuals navigated overlapping loyalties and survival strategies. Legal and social responses reflected the ambiguity. Laws were written to encourage ransom and to punish slavers, yet enforcement was uneven. Some rulers condemned the practice publicly while profiting indirectly from the economic system that sustained it. Merchants who specialized in shipping and brokerage could act as benefactors or exploiters depending on the transaction. Local elites sometimes protected communities by funding militias and ransoms, and sometimes profited from the chaos by seizing abandoned land. The result is a record full of contradictions, one that asks more questions and provides comfortable answers. This complexity matters for how we remember the past. If we insist on fixed categories of good and evil, we flatten the human landscape and lose the ability to learn. The borderlands were a place of constant negotiation, where people redefined themselves in response to danger and opportunity. That does not excuse brutality, nor does it romanticize resistance. It asks us to hold multiple truths at once. that captives could be both survivors and creators of new lives, that defenders could be both protectors and predators, and that states could be both instruments of rescue and engines of dispossession. When we tell this part of history, the goal is not to absolve or condemn without nuance. The goal is to trace the human choices that led to the outcomes we now study. By looking closely at the mixed motives and shifting identities, we better understand how communities cope, how loyalties change, and how memory was made. Those insights help us see why the story of the raids and the resistance cannot be reduced to a single moral headline. When the last great raids faded into the record, the plain did not simply return to what it had once been. Memory had settled into the land, into law, and into the bodies of those who survived. The villages that rebuilt kept watch in ways their grandparents never imagined. The families who had paid ransom carried both the relief of recovery and the burden of debt. The rivers that had been routes for rescue now also marked borders of loss. The change was not a tidy moral victory. It was a long exhaustion, a political realignment, and a social adaptation that remade communities in ways both visible and quiet. Yet even amid that complexity, there is a clear through line. Sustained human cruelty met sustained human refusal. People who had been hunted learned to organize. Neighbors became sentries. Boats that once carried captives homeward also became vehicles of rescue. The Cossacks, the militias, the families who pooled coins, and the clerics who begged princes all formed a web of resistance that made the trade in people costlier and, in time, less tenable. Institutions shifted, empires rebalanced, and the logistical networks that fed the markets frayed under pressure from force and diplomacy alike. The moral of this history is not simple. It does not let us place tidy blame or offer easy absolution. Some who fought to protect others later served new masters. Some who once raided settled into peaceful lives. Some captives found new families and new names. That ambiguity teaches a caution. When violence becomes an economy, ending it requires more than single acts of bravery. It requires sustained political will, the disruption of profit, and the slow repair of social bonds. It requires, too, remembrance, keeping the names and the small records alive so that later generations know the cost of silence. If there's an image to carry away, let it be the Dnieper at dawn. Imagine a narrow wooden boat straining under the weight of ragged people, a child asleep on a shawl, an elder holding a blurred token from a life that seemed lost. The boat moves toward a riverbank where neighbors have waited with lighted torches, where hands reach down to haul the returned into safety. That scene is not a neat ending, but it is a moral fulcrum. Life reclaimed is small, fragile, and worth the cost. We close with a question for you, because history does not end with scholars and archives. It continues in how we choose to remember and respond. Today, when people profit from the suffering of others in ways both obvious and hidden, what do? How do communities form defenses that are humane and just not simply reactive? How do institutions bear responsibility when markets reward cruelty? These are modern echoes of an older problem, and the answers demand our attention. If this story moved you, here's how we continue this work together, using the area framework. Attention! If this episode opened your eyes to a forgotten part of history, hit like so the algorithm can help others find the story. Relate. Share in the comments which part surprised you most, or tell us a family story you've heard about resistance and rescue. Your voice helps build a collective memory. Engage. Subscribe to History World and ring the bell if you want more episodes that dig into the human corners of the past, where policy and pain intersect. Ask. If you want a deep dive follow-up, comment deep dive on ransom records, or suggest a related topic you care about, and we'll make it the focus of our next video. These calls are not mere promotion. They are a request to join a conversation about memory, responsibility, and the ways communities protect one another. If you share these videos, you help make the past part of present debate. Finally, a short note on tone and truth. Stories like this ask us to hold sorrow and complexity at the same time. We tell and honor those who suffered, to understand the structures that made suffering profitable, and to learn how societies have, in the best moments, fought back. Our work on History World will keep searching the archives, reading the petitions, and listening to the laments so that the quiet records of ordinary people remain part of our common conscience. Thank you for sitting with this difficult history.